the history of diving museum. Tonight's presentation, our Immerse Yourself presentation, is sponsored by Key Dives out of Isla Mirada, a wonderful dive shop down the street. We've partnered and collaborated with them over the years, and we look forward to doing more in the future, and we're really thankful for being our sponsors tonight. Next month, we're going to have Searching for Sunken Treasures through Skin Diver magazine, and that's going to be presented by History of Diving Museum member and volunteer Barbara Overton. She's been involved for, oh gosh, probably 8 or 9 years now, and be updating us on all the history and some fun Florida Keys facts that have been in Skin Diver magazines over the years. But tonight we have Shelly Krueger with us, and she's going to be talking about sponges and water quality in the Florida Keys. Shelly is a marine biologist. She works with University of Florida and the Florida Sea Grant, as well as FWC. She also sits on the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary Advisory Council. And I don't know anybody, well, I know a few people, but I don't know that I know anybody who's more passionate about sponges, Shelly, than you are. So we really look forward to your presentation tonight. We thank you for the restoration efforts that you're doing and your wealth of knowledge. So I'm going to hand the presentation over to you and to Julia. Again, put where you're from, how many people you're watching with in our little chat box. If you have any questions while Shelly's giving her presentations, go ahead and put it in the chat box. If you're watching this later recorded on YouTube, put it in the comment box. We're going to monitor that and we'll get some answers back to you. So I hand it over, and we'll hear more soon.
Thank you, Lisa, very much. And I'm just one of many very passionate sponge lovers. So thank you for that introduction. And tonight we are going to talk about, I will give a brief history of sponging in the Florida Keys, water quality, and sponge restoration. When most people think about sponges, they think of the bath sponge. And the city of Key West has a very long history with sponges. Until the early 20th century, sponges were the second leading export, only second to hand-rolled cigars. And so here are some historic photos from the Key West Citizen of sponges on Green Street and sponges down on the docks. There is still a commercial sponge fishery in the Florida Keys, but it is a pretty small artisanal fishery. But the majority of the sponges harvested in the US still comes from the lower Keys, and they are sent to Tarpon Springs for finishing and distribution. The reality is that out of the more than 8,000 sponge species, only about 24 in the entire world are the types that can be harvested for bath sponges. And this is a photo of a sheep's wool sponge, Hippospongiolacne, which is the most valuable commercial sponge species in the Florida Keys. And the others are yellow, grass, glove, and vase sponges. In Monroe County, sponges must be hooked underwater and a minimum of at least 5 inches. And then outside of Monroe County, sponges must be cut underwater with a knife. As you can see from a map on the right, the Florida sponge grounds are in the Florida Keys, where they have to be hooked, and in the Big Bend area, where they have to be cut. So the photo on the left shows a hooker in the Florida Keys. They use a long pole with a hook to remove the sponges from the bottom. And then on the right is a sponge that has been cut across the top. In the 1980s, 2 Florida Sea Grant agents, John Steveley and Don Sweat, researched the survival of hooked sponges versus cut sponges. And as you can see from the bar graph, sponges that are cut survive at least 70% of the time, and sponges that are hooked survive about 40% of the time. So the survival is higher when the sponges are cut, but diving for sponges is more efficient and more sponges are removed from the area. And sponges can also be cut in more areas because the hookers are really confined to shallow depths on calm days. And now we are going to transition to talking about sponges and water quality. Sponges are incredibly important for water quality. They are the dominant filter feeders in the Florida Keys, and they are eating phytoplankton, bacteria, and viruses. They're also essential fish habitat for juvenile spiny lobsters, stone crabs, and bonefish. And just in Monroe County, these 3 species generate more than $150 million to the economy for food, fishing, and tourism. And a lot of people don't know, but sponges are animals, and they're arguably the oldest animals. Sometimes it goes back and forth between sponges and comb jellies, but any soft-bodied animal, it doesn't leave much of a historical record in the fossil record, but it goes back and forth, but arguably they're the oldest animals. And they are multicellular and have specialized cells, but they do not have organs. And as I mentioned, they're filter feeders. They bring water into the sponge chamber through thousands of pores called ostia, but water is only expelled from the osculum. And they may have multiple oscula, but far fewer than ostia. And so the diagram on the left is just a simplified version of the sponge body plan. And as I said earlier, sponges eat microscopic marine algae called phytoplankton, and they also eat bacteria and viruses. Sponges filter the water at rates that are so high, it's almost unbelievable. If you were to think of the average, a basketball size, basketball bouncing, okay. If you were to think of a basketball size sponge, an average of these 5 species, that could filter 429 gallons of water per hour. And before I came to the Florida Keys, I worked with eastern oysters in coastal Georgia, which has led me to consider the similarities between oysters and sponges. And sponges are basically the functional equivalent of oysters down in the Florida Keys, where we do not have eastern oysters, but we do have sponges, which are our dominant filter feeders. And both are very efficient filter feeders. An adult oyster can filter more than 30 gallons of water per day. And of course, most sponges are larger than a single oyster, but even so, sponges filter water at rates that are so high, it really does almost seem impossible. If you think again about a basketball-sized loggerhead sponge, it can filter around 300 gallons of water per hour, which is more than 7,000 gallons of water per day. And over the past 15 years, the value of oyster reef restoration has become pretty well known. And so it's my goal for sponge restoration to be just as well appreciated, which is why my new slogan is "Sponges are the new oysters." One of the objectives of a previous EPA-funded project that I had is the research question, how do 3 nearshore sponge species transform nitrogen in the water column? And so we picked 3 sponges that can be found in the nearshore waters: glove sponge, loggerhead sponge, and sheep's wool sponge. And many thanks to College of the Florida Keys, who let us use their outdoor flow through mesocosms for this experiment. In the blue tank on the left, I cut the sponges into tennis ball sized pieces and left them to heal for at least 30 days. And as far as I know, this was the first time an experiment designed for eastern oysters was adapted for sponges. And then we placed 1 sponge of each species into gas-tight chambers, and we measured changes in N2, nitrate, and ammonium over time. And we had 2 blanks to account for water column activity. And then we used syringes to remove water samples every 15 minutes per chamber for 2.5 hours. And what we found was that each sponge species was net nitrogen fixing. The figure on the left shows the net N2 fluxes in per gram wet weight of the sponges, where a negative flux is nitrogen fixation above denitrification. And I know it's a little bit hard to see the negative signs on the far left of that first figure. And then the figures on the left, again, indicate these sponges were making new nitrogen available to the system. The dissolved inorganic nitrogen fluxes are shown in the figure on the right. The majority of the nitrogen fixation was in the form of nitrate and also nitrite and ammonium. So this does mean these sponges are making nitrogen more bioavailable. And if you consider historically, the Florida Keys were nutrient limited, it isn't unexpected that these sponges and their microbial symbionts have likely evolved to serve the essential role of making nitrogen more available in the water column to other organisms. And now we're going to move into some of the threats. So unfortunately, sponges are vulnerable to many threats, and these threats include algal, cyanobacteria blooms, diseases, dredging, freshwater runoff, poor water quality, and hurricanes. And the photo on the right was sent to me by a volunteer following Hurricane Irma, and it was just tons of sponges that had washed ashore following Hurricane Irma. And one of the biggest present day threats are algal blooms. Beginning in 1991, there have been a series of algal blooms in Florida Bay that have killed more than 90% of the sponges living there. And this is really represented by this area inside of the yellow triangle. And this was likely caused by a cyanobacteria called Synecocococus, which causes the water to look like pea soup. And once such an extensive die-off occurs, the recovery of the sponge community can be lengthy because of their slow growth and other difficulties. So one thing I think that's really unusual about this is actually an example of the prey item, the cyanobacteria, killing its predator, because sponges eat Synecocococus. So it's kind of interesting of this like role reversal where the prey is able to kill what's basically, consuming it. So unfortunately, the losses of sponges causes a negative effect on the other species in Florida Bay. As you can see in this figure, an increase in the Synecococccus cyanobacteria leads to a decline in seagrasses and sponges, which in turn causes declines in water quality and the number of fish and crustaceans that live there. And this can really lead to a vicious cycle where recovery is difficult because as you have the seagrass die off, you have the contribution of more turbidity and more nutrients, and this in turn can stimulate more of these algal blooms. And this is a picture of a loggerhead sponge prior to this algal bloom where everything turned pea soup green. And then on the right, this is a photo of the same loggerhead sponge. And the same with this vase or basket sponge on the left. On the right, it's following the bloom, the algal bloom. And you can see that the sponges, they just really die and then deteriorate and decompose in place. In response to the sponge die-offs in Florida Bay, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission created a community sponge restoration program. And this is an example of a really great collaboration between partners that also includes the Nature Conservancy, the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, Old Dominion University, and the Florida Keys Environmental Fund. And of course, all of this was supported by the EPA and the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. And so sponge restoration is still very new compared to oyster reef restoration and even coral restoration. And when I talk about sponge restoration, I'm talking about the shallow water sponges that live on hard bottom, usually adjacent to seagrasses. Like these species on the top left is a loggerhead sponge, a vase or basket sponge. On the right, a brown branching sponge. Bottom left, golf ball sponge. In the middle, a sheepswool sponge, and then on the right, a glove sponge. And also when people think about the Florida Keys, a lot of times they think about the coral reefs, the seagrasses, and the mangroves. But if you look at the orange areas on this map, you can see that a huge portion of the habitat type is hard bottom. And this is really the area where the sponges like to live. This is a map of the FWC sponge nurseries and restoration sites. As you can see, the nurseries are mainly in Marathon, and the restoration sites are in Florida Bay, where these large scale sponge die-offs have occurred. The sponge restoration process is similar to coral restoration in that a piece is cut off and attached to a substrate to regenerate. On the left are Vase sponge propagules in the FWC permitted nurseries. And on the right, you can see that the Vase sponges have regrown their shape and look indistinguishable from what I guess you would call a natural vase or basket sponge in the vicinity. And these photos on the right were taken 4 years later. So sponge restoration is still pretty new. The FWC restored 15,000 sponges in 2019. And if you think again back to an average filtration rate of a basketball-sized sponge being 429 gallons of water per hour, thinking about these nearshore relatively common sponge species that are filtering 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, that would equal more than 56 billion gallons of water per year that's being filtered by these sponges. And of course, granted, there is a massive volume of water in Florida Bay. However, it shows the potential power of the sponges to improve water quality and clarity. And since I am an extension agent for the University of Florida IFAS Extension and Florida Sea Grant, one important component to me is the outreach and education about the importance of sponges for habitat and water quality. In 2019, the University of Florida released the newest Florida Master Naturalist program called Marine Habitat Restoration. And I wrote the sponge habitat restoration module. And we also have modules on seagrasses, corals, and artificial reefs. So if anyone is interested in taking one of these courses, please let me know. I have my email is on the last slide. And that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I can see the chat. If anyone wants to put the message, ask questions in the chat or unmute and ask that way.
So Shelly, this is Shirley Pomponi. I have more of a comment than a question. Do you want to just talk a little bit about some of the work that you're doing now as part of your PhD research in terms of trying to time when the best time of year would be for restoration, for sponge restoration? Because I think it's really important work and very interesting.
Sure. So we were just funded by the EPA on a 3-year project, and year 1 is we are going out monthly and collecting tissue samples from the loggerhead sponge and the sheep's wool sponge. So the sheep's wool is a dominant commercial species, and the loggerhead is really a dominant ecological species. And we're sampling them each month for 12 months to find their seasonality of when they're reproducing. And it's actually unknown right now whether or not, so I didn't talk at all about sponge reproduction, but there can be boy sponges and there can be girl sponges. Some can be, so for the loggerhead sponge, it's unknown if the sexes are separate. So we're gonna find out if there's male sponges and female sponges. And then so year 2, the idea is to start sampling the propagated sponges in order to see how quickly they become reproductive after they've been propagated and restored. Because as you can imagine, when you're cut into a dozen fist-sized pieces, it takes a little bit of time to recover and reorganize and regrow. And so seeing how long it takes for them to become reproductive again, once we've identified kind of the high times that they're spawning.
Thanks, Shelly. Also, may I ask another question? Is that
Sure.
okay, Lisa? Okay, so wait, maybe I'll turn on my camera too. Start video. So my other question is, because I'm really intrigued. Do you know the reason why? I'm sure you know the answer to this question. What is the reason why in the Keys they have to be hooked, but up on the west coast of Florida they have to be cut?
So that's part of why my last slide is this picture of Beneath 12 Mile Reef. It was a movie that came out in 1953, and it really highlights the history of the really conflict between a lot of Bahamian origin people down in the Florida Keys versus a lot of the Greeks that dominated the area in Tarpon Springs, and kind of the boats were burnt, and there was a lot of controversy historically between the sponge divers. I don't actually know the history of why the cutting versus the hooking, but I do know that a lot of it culturally goes back to those original conflicts between the Greeks and the Bahamians.
Thank you.
And I think that there's talk of showing Beneath 12 Mile Reef at the History of Diving Museum and the next time.
Yeah, we're talking about having a movie night either here or over at the brewery. Once daylight savings times change, so it gets dark earlier. And then do a night so everybody can watch their emails, because as soon as we get that organized, we'll put it out in one of our e-blasts. And Shelly, to speak to Shirley's question, at the last Sanctuary Advisory Council, I was talking to Mimi Stafford, and she said there's actually 2 either families or 2 organizations that still do the hooking out of Key West. And because they were so anti-free divers and helmet Greek divers, that way back in the day, they did a law that you could only get sponges by hooking in Monroe County. So now they're bound by the law that they instituted because of that huge rivalry with the Greek divers. As far as I know, I am no sponge expert and no sponge historian, but that's the last thing I heard as an explanation.
It was basically to keep the competition out, which, you know, they were fighting so much, there was a whole movie made about it.
Yep. Yeah.
Shelly, I do think we have some questions in the chat. Did you want me to read those out to you, or can you view them? I see the first one here from Sam Abe.
Why don't you go ahead, Julia, and get her prompted.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I have first question here. Is there a measure of quality of filtered water, like for oysters versus sponges? Like, is there a measure between the difference of the quality of the water?
Like at following filtration?
Yeah.
You mean like who's more efficient, like an oyster or a sponge?
I think that is the question, yes.
Okay. Well, I don't, so they are filter feeders of phytoplankton, but I don't think there's ever been like a comparison of, you know, test a sponge for an hour and an oyster for an hour and see what the differences of the water quality. So I just don't know the answer to that.
Okay. The next question was, is this project still active?
Yes. So I am a PhD student at the University of Florida, and a big part of this is the 5 chapters that I'm going to need for my dissertation. So all of this is ongoing. FWC is still very keen to work on sponge restoration. Unfortunately, with stony coral tissue loss disease, it's really been all hands on deck to deal with that. And now we're hearing word of a diadema die-off in the US Virgin Islands. And so on top of COVID, that's really taken precedent over a lot of the sponge research, but it is definitely ongoing. And I'm just here to spread the word and get more sponge converts so we can all realize how important these sponges are for not only the water, but our economy.
Great. Another question was, is this course still available online?
So the course, if you go to University of Florida, Florida Master Naturalist, it's being offered virtually, hybrid, and in person. And also, if a group of 10 people or so wanted to get together, I'd be willing to teach it down here in person. So yes, it's ongoing and it's active indefinitely.
Okay.
With this class, once they take it, will they be able to utilize their new information?
So it was designed, these special topic courses, because so many people are volunteering with coral restoration, with mangrove restoration. There's a whole nother module that's on oysters, mangroves, and seagrasses, so that people who are volunteering in these endeavors have a background of what they're doing and why, and the life history and different things. So it's really to supplement people who want to volunteer and work with organizations like Coral Restoration Foundation and iCare and these MOAT people who are helping, especially down here with coral restoration. But yeah, we would love, in the future to be able to ramp up sponge restoration in the same way as coral restoration. Okay. Speaking for myself.
I guess a follow-up to that question would be, how can volunteers get involved with sponge restoration?
That's a good question. Right now, we don't have anything active. Right before COVID started, they actually, on the FWC Coral Crew listserv, had sent out an invitation for people to come help restore sponges in Florida Bay. And that was literally going to be like March 20th, 2020. And so now, as I said, with stony coral tissue loss disease and people really just starting to go back out on the water in groups, hopefully we'll start seeing some things like that in the next year or so.
Okay. This person asked, are there any other sponge restoration projects going on globally?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
I think we have Kylie Smith on. I don't know. She might be able to give any updates to what iCare is doing. I don't know if we have anybody on from Coral Restoration to see what they have, but iCare was able to, because of a PhD candidate, do about 2 months of restoration efforts, where they took some out of, similar to the coral restoration, but it was sponge restoration dives, and they did it weekly and for about 2 months while their PhD candidate was in doing some research. And I don't know, Kylie, if you could speak to this, if they're able to continue those as part of that research study, or if that's gonna take a pause until Bobby comes back in town.
Hey, Lisa. Hey, everybody. This is Kylie from iCare. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Yeah, so this was the second summer of us doing those projects. And so we are pausing for a while Bobby goes back to school. But we will have one more summer, at least guaranteed, that we've got some funding to help support that project. And so we will be running sponge trips again next summer. Outside of that, I'm not 100% sure yet. It'd be awesome if iCare could continue doing that, but right now we're really reliant on Bobby and her team.
And I think, Shelly, as you do more work and as it proves to be successful, I'm hoping, my fingers are crossed, that these organizations can kind of continue the process that you guys are studying and proving they're effective.
Yeah, me too. And I know Mission Iconic Reefs is looking at a whole host of other species, you know, including the long-spine sea urchin and the mithrax, the Caribbean king crab. So maybe at some point we'll see sponges added to that repertoire of other species that support corals.
Okay, I believe there are a couple more questions. This person is asking, as there are for salmon, shrimp, etc., is there any initiative to have sponge farms to supplement the commercial harvesting of sponges?
So when I first read that, I was thinking about polyculture, because there are some aquaculture facilities out in situ, out in the wild, where they use sponges around them kind of as remediation for the different fish farming that they might be doing. But I think what you're asking is are there commercial leases like there are for oysters and clams and mussels, where the leaseholder, you know, farms those in the ocean? And so I don't know of any in the United States, but I can envision a future where there are sponge leases, where because the spongers in the Big Bend area are having to go out farther and deeper. And if you could have your own sponge farm closer to shore, it would save on fuel and it could be more efficient. So as far as I know, there aren't any right now in the United States. There are elsewhere in Micronesia and probably, I want to say, the Philippines. But in the US, I don't know of any.
Okay. I think the last question was from the person asking about that course that was offered. They're asking, what is the name of the online class and where can we find it?
So it's the Florida Master Naturalist program offered through the University of Florida. And so the course offerings would be, if you went to the, you can really just put in UF, FMNP, and it'll show all the courses and who's offering them. There is a cost, it's $175 per person to take them. And I offered one last year. There's a group I know that's going to be offering it this fall, but also you can contact me and I can help you find a course if you need help finding a course.
Okay, I do think that is all of the questions, although Shirley has said her group at Harbor Branch is working on novel approaches to sponge restoration, and she'll talk about it during her Immerse Yourself in September. All right, so if you have any closing comments, or if anyone else has any comments or questions for Shelley, just type them in the chat, and thanks so much for doing this talk.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
I look forward to more collaboration, and the History Diving Museum is just really an honor, so I thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. And as a thank you, we actually saved one of our sponge restoration t-shirts for you. And as another thank you, that you are a proud card-carrying member of the History of Diving Museum, you too can come 362 days, we are closed 3, to check out not only the sponge exhibit, but the rest of the core exhibits that we have, because we are open daily. You can come up anytime. Everybody says, oh, it's a great thing to do on a rainy day, which it is, but it's also a really good thing to do to get out of that sweltering summer heat and get into the AC for a little bit. So we're excited about the sponge exhibit and having you with us tonight. So thank you very much. And thank you everybody else for participating. We are going to be, this is recorded and we'll be putting it on the History of Diving Museum's YouTube channel probably tomorrow.
Great, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.